So we're excited to celebrate 1 year. Landmarks landmarks are important. If you've had a child before, you know that you love to celebrate their 1 year birthday. It's so cute, but not their 17-year birthday because it's so expensive. But we love to celebrate landmarks. We're obviously excited. There's a lot of work that's been done and sort of in preparing for the new ministry season. So we're not just preparing for next week. Next week's a great day, but it's almost kind of irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. We're preparing for a great year ahead for Altar Church. And so obviously, as we talked about this morning, we started asking you to invite people. And that's honestly, I think, annoying, because if you've got a great church, you invite people anyhow. You just do that. When you're proud of something, you want to talk to people about it. But we also want to encourage and equip you, and so that's why we've given you those cards. Now, when you're inviting people, most people will ask, when you ask people, you may say, hey, will you come to church with me? And maybe they've never been to church before, so you get all sorts of responses, and many of them are negative. I don't want to go to church, and I hate church, and they just want your money, all sorts of other stuff. And then they say that one thing that's like a super pet peeve of mine. They're like, if I go to church, the place will burn down. This place is made out of bricks, okay? It's not going to go anywhere, so just come to church and check it out. And some people, they may not be negative, but they're not really committed. They'll say something like, if you ask them, well, Jesus is okay, Jesus is all about love, or Christianity is about loving other people. And all of this is true, and what it means is that Christians and Christianity have done a somewhat effective job of representing Jesus' goal to love people well. And so a lot of people, if you ask them, what's Christianity about? They'll say, well, it's about the golden rule. Have you ever heard of that before, the golden rule? Anybody heard of that? You don't have to be a Christian to hear the golden rule. And essentially it's love your neighbor as yourself. It's a pretty good rule. If we follow it well, it'll make a difference. Because at the heart of it is compassion, like we talked about last week. I was sort of trying to figure out what to talk about before we get into this new ministry season. I'm going to have a sermon series, 5-week sermon series on David called Legacy. And I had these 2 weeks to fill, and I didn't really know what I was going to preach on. It's kind of turning into this little mini sermon series on compassion. And one thing I said last week that I don't know, kind of accidentally wrote down is, and I think I really like it, is compassion without restriction. You didn't memorize it yet, but you will. I'm going to say about 150 times today. Compassion without restriction. So I want you to do is to practice this, is to turn to the person next to you and say compassion without restriction. I'm looking at you. You better do it. Or say something, say good morning or something. That's good. You guys just made friends. Anybody make friends? Good. That's good. That's good. That's good. I love the fall attire. You guys are looking like pumpkin spice and just looking great this morning. Compassion without restriction. It's the same thing as love your neighbor as yourself. It's a great thing to say. It's a great quote. But to get to the richness and meaning behind that scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, we have to do what I love to do, which is go to the passage in its context. Because when you go to the passage in its context, it comes alive and teaches us all sorts of things about how to be better and more equipped to live that Christian life and to become better and more equipped to have a great church. So what I want you to do is open your Bibles to Luke 10. Luke chapter 10. If you want a Bible, we'll give one to you. I feel like I'm reading your Miranda rights. If you like a Bible, we will appoint one to you. If you don't want a Bible, open up your cell phones, open up the Bible app. If you're just like me and super lazy, you can just look right up there. So Luke 10, 27 through 37. As you read Luke 10 in its context, what's happening is Jesus is being confronted by a religious leader. A man who was a teacher and expert at the law or the Torah or the Pentateuch, which is like the Old Testament. It's kind of what the Jewish people believed at the time, what Jesus also believed. And this man is asking Jesus about that book. And he's wanting to know, Jesus, how do you get to heaven? Now, we don't really know this man's motives, but oftentimes when Jesus was asked these questions by these religious leaders, they were trying to catch him in a trap. Because what they wanted to do is they wanted to challenge Jesus with these paradoxical questions. If he answered wrong, it would discredit him or they'd give them a reason to arrest him. They didn't like Jesus. So the man asked, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus answers the question with a question. Jesus says, "Well, bro, what does our religious book say about that topic?" Because again, Jesus was a Jewish man and so was this other man. And they both believed in the Torah or the Pentateuch or the Old Testament. So Jesus is referring him back to that book. And the man answers, he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." That's where that love your neighbor part comes from in the Bible. So Jesus says, yes, that's what you got to do. That's it. Love God, love your neighbor. Like, this is it right here. Like, you want to know about how to please God, how to be in the center of God's will, love God, love your neighbor. If that's all you need today, you can go home. You're dismissed. If you want to keep hearing the sermon, you can sit down and stay. All right. Love God, love your neighbor. You do that, you're going to get to where you want to go. But the guy wasn't really sure what Jesus was talking about. So he asked for clarity. He says, "Okay, who is my neighbor?" Now, keep in mind that for the Jewish people of the time, they were very inwardly focused. They really loved their own community, people who were just like them, and they really didn't like anybody else. You remember the story about last week, the leper and how they would say unclean? Well, really anybody who wasn't a practicing Jewish person that was practicing well and doing the right things, wasn't born into that race, was unclean, okay? They were sort of like, just didn't really want to be around them, okay? So Jesus, of course, knows this. And so he answers by telling the story many of you have probably heard maybe 100 times. And even if you haven't heard it before, there's a man's name, or rather a title of a man that you've heard before in all sorts of contexts that starts from right here. So starting in Luke 10, verse 30. Jesus is telling the story to this religious man, and he says, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him, and they went away, leaving him half dead." So Jesus just starts by describing this very bleak situation because, I'll be honest, you probably don't know what it means to travel from Jerusalem to Jericho. You've been there before? Probably not. You ever traveled from Jerusalem to Jericho? If you did, there was roads. No roads happening here. Okay, there's a path. It's a mountain pass, Lord of the Rings type stuff here. It's steep, it's dangerous. There's all sorts of bandits and robbers. So if you want to imagine what this was like, try to think of like the scariest place that you can imagine, okay? Like maybe there's like a certain part of town, or maybe it's like being in the woods. For me, it's like being in the basement and you turn the lights off and you gotta run upstairs real quick before the monsters get you. That's me, okay? It's scary stuff, all right? So this guy's in a very scary situation. The road between Jerusalem and Jericho was 19 miles and had a drop in elevation of almost 3,500 feet. So it was scary. People were out to get people who were on this road because Jerusalem was very wealthy and Jericho was very wealthy. So if you're on this road, you probably had money, okay? So what's predictable is that this man was traveling and he was robbed. Happened all the time. He was robbed, he was beaten to the point of being close to death. He's stripped naked. And anybody here want to be naked on the side of the road? No. It's humiliating. He's on this road that no one travels because it's too dangerous. So it's a very bleak situation. Beaten, half dead, naked, and ain't nobody coming. So he's in a terrible situation, and he's likely to die. And it says in verse 31, and by chance, a priest was going down that road. I think it's funny, Jesus says, and by chance, meaning like, that guy's so lucky. He's lucky. A priest is walking by. And the priest was required to serve in Jericho. The priest had a rotation. They'd have to go down to Jericho to serve. So the priest was going from Jerusalem to Jericho. He would also be in a hurry, okay? Why would he be traveling this road? He normally wouldn't. There were better ways to go to Jericho that weren't so dangerous, but he was probably in a hurry. Why? Because no one took this road. So if you're on this man lying on the side of the road half dead and you see this priest, you got to be feeling pretty good, right? You're thinking, okay, I'm half dead, but here comes a priest. Someone is actually walking by on this road. This is a miracle. I'm naked, which is unfortunate, but I'm safe. Here comes a priest. But it says, when the priest saw him, he passed by on the other side. So the priest doesn't just keep walking. It's not that he didn't notice the guy. He literally got out of the way and moved to the other side of the street. Anybody here a runner? A couple people run. You've been in a run before. I'm not a runner, but I've ran a time or two. Okay? When you're running, sometimes you smell something funny, right? Anybody know what I'm talking about? What's that? What's that? And you're like, I don't know what that is, but I don't like the way it smells. And I'm breathing hard, and I'm going to get sick. And then you're walking by and you see a dead something, raccoon, roadkill, whatever it is. And you quickly move to the other side of the road, don't you? Right, that's what you do because you're going to get sick. And that's what the priest does. He sees this guy and he goes over, he's like, you nasty. And he goes to the other side of the road and he keeps walking. Now, we don't know what he was up to, but we know he must have been in a hurry because otherwise he wouldn't have taken this dangerous route. But he avoids the man, and if you're this man, half dead, lying there, you've got to be discouraged. Maybe this is it. But then Jesus continues the story, and he reports, a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him. So the priest didn't pan out. But if you got to choose some people to find you on the side of the road, priest is number one. Levite is probably number two. Because a Levite is a religious man, like a clergyman, like a leader in the church. Okay? He's a guy that you'd probably you'd want him to find you. Now, the King James Version says that the Levite came and looked on him and passed by to the other side. Came and looked on him and then passed by to the other side of the road. So the priest, he kind of sees him and moves over, but the Levite stops, sees this guy, walks up to him, takes a smell or something. I don't know what he does, but he keeps walking. Oh, that's rather interesting. This guy's almost dead. All right, see you later. Gotta go. So you got two religious guys, men who are commanded by their own religious restrictions not to abandon even a stray animal. Remember that Torah I talked about, that Pentateuch, that Old Testament, it says when you find a stray animal, you have to help it. You're not even allowed to leave a stray animal beside. And these guys know this, but they pass by. Their own countrymen, one of their own people, a fellow Israelite lying dead on the side of the road, suffering, thirsty, humiliated. They see him and they leave him. They look at him, and whatever pity they might feel, whatever sorrow they might feel, is superseded by their own need to get moving and get to where they got to go. So if you're this guy and you're sitting there and these people have passed you by, what are you thinking? I'm going to die. Hope is over. I'm dead. That's the end of my story. But Jesus keeps reading, and he says, but a Samaritan. You heard that word before? Samaritan. Who was on a journey, came upon him. And when he saw him, he felt compassion. A Samaritan, and I'm sure you've heard this word before, Good Samaritan. We've all heard this word before. A Samaritan is kind of like that crazy cousin that you have. Anybody here got a crazy cousin? Don't raise your hand. You know what I'm talking about. It's that cousin that has, they're on that People of Walmart website. You share it with your other family members. Uncle Jeb is on the website. And he's got 38 cats in his yoga pants, right? He's got that raccoon skin hat on, no shirt, cowboy boots at Walmart, right? You know what I'm talking about. Maybe it's not your cousin. Maybe it's your husband. You have to pick his clothes out for him, for church. Like, you got to tell him to brush his teeth. My wife in the back, she's like, amen. Anybody here with that kind of person? Don't raise your hand. Don't do it. But you know what I'm talking about. That's the Samaritan. The Samaritan is related to the Jewish people. They have this similar belief in God. Their theology or understanding of who God is a little bit different, but they're like the black sheep in the family, okay? They didn't talk to each other. They didn't get together for Christmas. There was no Christmas, but whatever. They didn't get together for holidays. They didn't hang out. They didn't have any kind of relationship. They weren't sending birthday cards. So this Samaritan man encounters this Jewish man on the road, and of course this guy is half dead and he's naked, and he walks over to him just like the priest did. And he walks over to him just like the Levite did, but unlike the Levite and the priest, he had compassion for him. Here's what Jesus reports. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he puts the man on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, this is 2 months' wages, by the way, take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. So as this man lay suffering and dying, life fading, hope fading, this black sheep, this dirty foreigner, this Samaritan from a rejected race does something unlikely. He bandages and cleans the wounds of his enemy. Not just with water, but with wine and oil, which are prized commodities. He's not providing second-class care. Compassion without restriction. Compassion without restriction. Listen, he doesn't go up to the guys like, okay, listen, I see that you're really struggling here. You're probably going to die. But there's something we got to talk about. You know, you and I, we kind of disagree on our theology here. You know, like, I think you believe some things that aren't quite in line with what I believe. Can we sort through those things right now? Can we, talk about those and get them worked out before I help you? What do you think? Oh, you don't want to? Well, I'm sorry, man, but I got to go because we got to sort through this stuff before I can help you. No. He puts the guy on his own animal. Remember, this guy's on a journey. He's well packed. He's got a donkey. He's traveling along, ready for what he's got to do. But he puts this man on his donkey. And of course, this means the wounded man is on the Samaritan's animal. And the Samaritan is now walking on this dangerous terrain with a long robe on and some sandals, which aren't great for hiking on cliffs. He trades his comfort for the comfort of another. This Samaritan used his wine, his oil, his bandages, places the man on his animal, and leads him to an inn. And it's important to know that this inn is not in Samaria, where it would have been much quicker and easier to take him. This inn is in the Jewish man's country. So to take this man to an inn, this Jewish man to an inn in the Jewish man's country, meaning the Samaritan is traveling with a wounded Jewish man on his donkey, which does what? Puts him in danger of being killed. He's risking his life. And when he reaches the inn, he pays for the care of the injured man. Not for a day, not for a week, but 2 months worth of care. And the Samaritan then says to the innkeeper, I'll give you all he needs to get well and more. So this shows you that the Samaritan is generous, but it also shows the severity of the Jewish man's condition. The Samaritan doesn't know this man, but he provides more than just basic care. He makes an investment to ensure that he was cared for and nourished back to health. These men don't work together. They don't live within 100 miles of one another. They don't come from the same family. They don't go to the same church. Yet the Samaritan saves this man's life at tremendous personal cost. And so Jesus finishes the story. And it's sort of, it's like, here's my story. What do you think? And he turns back to the religious guy and he asks him a question. And Jesus says to this guy who asked the question, who is my neighbor? Jesus says, who do you think the neighbor was? I've told you the story. What's your answer? Well, the answer was clear. And he answered, his neighbor was the one who showed mercy. Now, these words are powerful, and they don't need commentary. Like, again, you say amen, you can go home, you get it. It's powerful. It's transcendent, meaning it wasn't just for them, it's for us too. He says, who's my neighbor? Jesus tells a story. Okay, the neighbor's the one who showed mercy and compassion, and then Jesus says, go and do the same. Go and do the same. Now, when we read the Bible, what we want to do is we want to bridge the gap between that culture, where it was written, and our culture, where we're reading it now. We want to find meaning and application in that. Sometimes it's really hard to do. In this case, it's pretty easy. Jesus wanted the Jewish man to understand and wants us to understand that being a neighbor has absolutely nothing to do with proximity. It has nothing to do with how close someone lives to you. Nothing to do at all. It has nothing to do with relationship or kinship or things that you have in common. Sometimes your neighbor is a person or a group of people that you've never even met before. I was talking to Brian Santos the other day. We live pretty close to each other, and we're talking about, the anniversary of our church, and when we first met, 4 or 5 years ago, I've only had one cup of coffee. I haven't had any coffee this morning. That's what the problem is here. 4 or 5 years ago, I don't know, thanks Peter, I'll get it later. 4 or 5 years ago, we went to New York City, and we had all these kids, and we got off the bus, and we were all Caucasian kids, all right? And we were going into a place where it was very diverse. Very diverse. And what happened was we met these people that we wanted to serve with, these people from another church, and it was a bunch of Hispanic young people, okay? Brian and our friend Eddie and all these people who we've maintained these friendships with and who periodically come to stay in my basement. Pretty awesome. But we met these people, and we were from an entirely different context of society. We've never met anyone like them, and they never met anyone like us. But what happened was we started loving each other as neighbors, okay? And then together, we started loving people in the community as neighbors. And so what Brian said to me was that when you guys first came to us, we were moved by how you wanted to love us. And we were moved by how they wanted to love the people around them. We became neighbors together. We loved neighbors together. This is exactly what Jesus wanted to impress upon that religious man that day. Our neighbors, the people that we are called to love, is anyone we encounter who needs it. Our neighbor is anyone who needs compassion without restriction. Now, proximity doesn't make a neighbor. In other words, your neighbors aren't just defined by the people you live next to. But those people are still your neighbors. We have the responsibility to love and show compassion without restriction to all people. But that certainly includes the people who are the closest to you. And that's one of the reasons why the story is so compelling. The people close in proximity didn't help. And so that's why this story has this little bit of shock value to it, because the people who could do something and should do something did nothing. The people that this injured man worshiped next to, or probably saw daily at the marketplace, merely went about their business as this man suffered. So when you hear the story, you get kind of mad. You're like, man, I'm going to jump in there. I'm going to kick their butts and I'm going to help that guy. Like, you want to do something about it. But what I wonder is how often these things happen around us. I'm not just talking about in church. I'm talking about in society. There are all sorts of people around us that struggle in all sorts of ways. And I'll tell you, it's my belief that there is an utter lack of compassion in our society, in our neighborhoods. What I think we do really well is respond when things get really, really, really bad. When there are hurricanes or natural disasters or great tragedies, people come together. Neighborhoods come together, and it's really cool to see. Like, I look over there, and this room is full of water. And you see churches doing all sorts of things and communities doing all sorts of things for people who are struggling through hurricanes and natural disasters. We must support people suffering wherever we find them. Compassion without restriction, from Ohio to Florida, from Ohio to Texas, from Ohio to Mexico. But there's also daily suffering that occurs right where we live. The stuff that goes on every single day in every single home on our street, okay? There's suffering and pain in every family, I promise you that. If you live in Ashtabula County, you live in the poorest county in the state. If you live in Lake County, you live at the epicenter of the heroin problem in our state. If you live in Painesville, you live in a town that has nearly all of Lake County's homeless population. And 75% of the students in our high school and grade school are below the poverty level in the city of Painesville. It's very likely that you know somebody who is secretly struggling with mental illness. There are moms all around us. We got a lot of little kids in this church. Got a lot of moms who don't feel like they can cut it, that are incredibly discouraged. You know somebody like that? I bet you do. There are dads who are out of work, and they're wondering how they're going to support their family. And then there's that stigma, like, I can't be a man if I'm not providing. So you've got men who are struggling. And there are couples who came to church who had terrible arguments in the parking lot on the way here, who are putting on a face just to survive in this church. There's people who relapsed recently, are struggling through a great deal of turmoil. Someone so guilt-ridden that they don't think they've got the right to be here. Now, this is you. I'm not talking about you. Like, I don't know things about you. But what I'm describing is what happens in every single church on Sunday morning. Every single church in America. And it happens here too. And there's things that I don't even know about. There's things that I can't even imagine that are happening in people's lives. This stuff is happening. Suffering and pain and loss and things we don't know about. Things that we don't know about. But the question is, what if we did know? What if, like, we all wore these white t-shirts? And on these white t-shirts, it had, like, our top 10 list of junk that's going on in our lives. And we list it in order of what's happening. Like, what if we could see these t-shirts that everyone's wearing? So you would see hers, and you would see theirs, and we'd all see it. You think we'd do anything about it? Do you think that you would do everything in your power to do something about that problem or one of those problems? To offer some kind of love or support to the people around you? I think we like to think we would. But human behavior human behavior patterns suggest that we might not. There's this phenomenon that people fall into known as the bystander effect. The bystander effect predicts that certain factors will determine our willingness to help someone who is in distress. There is this study, and I'm not lying to you, I'm going to tell you the truth about this, okay? Not that I lie or embellish stories, never do that. But there was a Bible college, and they tried to replicate some of the conditions of this story. They got him in, they put some makeup on him, and he pretended to be hurt. And the religious people, these Bible college students, listen to me, these Bible college students who were literally on their way to preach a sermon about this story, I'm not making this up, helped that man only 43% of the time. Now, I'm not good at the maths, but that's not a high number. They didn't help because they were in a hurry. I gotta preach this message. I gotta get there and prepare, get all prayed up, get my notes ready, work on my catchphrases, make sure my lines are right, get my jokes right. Sorry, bro, gotta go. Gotta preach. Amen, praise the Lord. People valued their time more than they valued the person who was hurt in front of them. And what's fascinating is this problem, this bystander effect, seems to get worse with more people. The more people who are witnessing an event, the less likely it is that someone's going to do something about it. You've probably heard this on the news. There was a story a couple years ago about a man who was stabbed in New York City. And this guy would have lived, but hundreds of people literally stepped over him and on their way to do whatever they had to do, and this guy bled to death over the course of several hours. The psychologists who study this bystander effect identify 4 steps that every person goes through when they see an emergency or a problem. The first thing they do is they notice that something's going on. Oh, look there, something's happening. The second thing they do is interpret the situation as being an emergency. Call 911. Something's happening. They're bleeding. Number 3, they decide how much responsibility they feel for taking action. Number 4, they implement the action choice, meaning they do something about it. So when bystanders do nothing instead of something, there's always a breakdown in one of those 4 steps. Either they don't notice, they don't believe that the problem is a big deal, they don't feel responsible, or they don't know how to act. Where do you think that we might go wrong? Just as neighbors, as Christians, as people in a community, where do you think we might go wrong? Maybe it's number 2. Maybe we wouldn't think that the problem is an emergency. If we could see those things on people's t-shirts at 1 through 10, all that stuff, maybe we'd see something like bankruptcy or depression or loneliness or out of a car or out of a job, and we wouldn't think that's an emergency. Oh, shoot, I've done that. Whatever, suck it up. Maybe you wouldn't think the problems are a big deal. But how would you know if you never asked somebody? How would you know if you never said, "Are you okay?" How would you know if you never said, "Do you need someone to talk to? Can I buy you coffee? Can I hear you out?" We may find out if we do that their hurt is more than an emergency. We might find out that your question or concern is the difference between life and death, victory or defeat in the life of that struggling and suffering human being. You see, the pain of another human being is always an emergency. And I want you to think about the person next to you. Maybe you know them. Maybe you came to church with them. And maybe you know that they are struggling with something. And maybe you're even a part of it, but you got some pride built up. You got some hurt built up. There's something that's bothering you that you got to sort through before you talk to them. Realize that their hurt, their pain, their struggle is an emergency. And you can do something about it. Maybe our breakdown happens at number 3. Maybe we don't think the problem is our responsibility. Maybe as you look around and you see all those people in those shirts and they got all those emergencies, you say to yourself, well, there's nothing I can do about that one. They're broke, so am I. Not my problem. I just paid my car off. I'm going to spend my extra money on some vacation, going to Hawaii, summer staycation forever. They're depressed. I'm no doctor. I'm no counselor. That's not my issue. They can't work because they don't have a car. They don't have a car because they got too many kids. You know what? Shouldn't have had all them kids. Not my problem. All have to learn somehow, right? Imagine if the Samaritan man looked at the dying man and said, well, you're the fool who took this road without a donkey. That's not my problem. And then just left him there to die. I think you could imagine that because that's how you felt. That's how you felt before the Samaritan found you. Because when we read this story, we are reading about a man who was an outcast. A man who was rejected and despised. An outcast who found a hopeless person and gave that hopeless person his very best. And then he cared for them and nurtured them, surrendered his rights for them, brought him back to safety. And he says, I'll pay it all. Whatever it takes, I'll pay it all because it is finished. And the wounded, hopeless man was healed. You see, Jesus is telling us this story about compassion without restriction. He's telling us this story because it's a story about himself. It's a story about himself and how he sees us and what he's done for us. I want you to know that we don't have a bystander, we have a redeemer. We don't have an observer, we have a restorer. And what this means for us is that we are called to active compassion. We are called to seek out hurting people, and when we find them, we may not know what to do. But what we have to know is that hurt is always real. The hurt is always an emergency. That we each have a responsibility. And though there may be many of us, I don't know what's going to happen with this church. I don't know what's going to happen in your personal lives. I don't know about your neighborhood, but there may be many of us. The responsibility belongs to each of us. As representatives of Jesus, the responsibility belongs to each of us to love people well. Now, how we do that, the way we comfort people and help people, our method of compassion, I know that's something that you probably worry about. How am I going to do that? Because so often we don't know what to do. We don't know what to say, and that's that pressure we put on ourselves. I have to feel like I can do something tangible. I have to feel like I can say something profound. And if I can't help. That's a lie. That's not true. Compassion without restriction. Jesus has equipped us with everything that we need to love people well. Just step forward. Just be willing. Be present. Be willing to have patient grace. Start by saying, I am here for you. And let Jesus guide your steps, teaching you how to love your neighbor as yourself.